Well, it's a wonderful opportunity to have this conversation this evening here with you, William. Obviously, I'm a great fan of yours, and I thought perhaps we could begin with you just talking a little bit about this new project, The Head and the Load, addressed to the experience of Africa within the history of the First World War.
So, Paul, first of all, an enormous welcome to you, to the studio, to the Centre for the Less Good Idea. It is the Centre for the Less Good Idea, but that does not mean it's the Centre for No Ideas. And so the range and depth of your thinking we're hoping to mine further today. What I thought I would do is we would start with an introduction to the project, The Head and the Load, which is at the moment under construction in this studio and in the studio at home, that will be performed in London in July. And it has three different origins, and I'll talk about this because one of the ongoing themes of the centre, but of the project, has to do with trying to think in material, starting with an inauthentic origin, in other words, from some starting point which may be completely not the result of clear thinking, but from opportunity, from moments, from whim, and seeing how in the process of working one can track down and find a meaning and find ideas through that process. So the project, which will be shown in London in the very large Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern, started with a project we did in Rome, which was a large processional piece along the walls of the Tiber called Triumphs and Laments, which had as its general theme the imbrication, the connection of triumphs and laments, that everybody's triumph is always somebody else's lament, and that the images we see of people moving across the Mediterranean from Africa into Italy and into Europe are not a completely new thing. They're in the great Roman triumphs. What was paraded was the success of Rome, which meant the enslavement of other people, including people from North Africa. So that connection was a theme in Triumphs and Laments. Then there was an invitation from a building, from the Armory in New York, which is a drill hall, a very large drill hall, to do a performance in that hall. And it struck me that some of the things we'd learnt on the walls of the Tiber River we could play with in the Armory. And the third starting point was a production of Wozzeck, the Albenberg opera, which we did a workshop for and did it as a intimation of the First World War. It's a play written in 1837, but the ideas of militarism in it seemed very germane, and we set it in the First World War. And the workshop we did, even though the opera was performed in Salzburg, was done here in the studio, using Johannesburg-based actors, dancers, performers to find a language for it. And we found such interesting things in that workshop that it seemed such a waste for those to simply be massacred by the Austrian chorus and singers who were going to be doing it. And it seemed that then when this offer came from the Armory, that some of the material we'd found at the side of preparing for this Albenberg opera could be developed further, and some of the things we'd found on the Tiber could be developed further. And so it became a project about the First World War, and specifically Africa in the First World War and the First World War in Africa. And that's something I'm sure you have many things about war in Africa and militarism in Africa from outside and inside. Because, of course, there were two wars. There was African laborers and soldiers taken from Africa, from southern Africa, from all other parts, from Senegal, onto the Western Front in Europe. And they were not the only people. There were people from West Indies, from India, from China, huge numbers of people from different parts of the world brought to France. But the main focus, in fact, is on the war in Africa. And the war in Africa, just to remind people, the first shots in the First World War fired in anger were fired in Togo, before there was any fighting on the Western Front in Europe. And the war in Africa continued until 2 weeks after the armistice. In terms of numbers of soldiers, it was much smaller than that in Europe. But through accidents of history, millions of Africans were conscripted, some as soldiers, but the vast majority as laborers, as carriers of the war. And this was very simply because the railway lines didn't go all the way to the fronts, as they did in Europe. And secondly, tsetse flies made it impossible to use horses and draft animals because they all died. And so the war was literally put onto people's heads. And they had quotas, that each soldier had 3 carriers to carry his food and his kit bag and his ammunition, and each officer had 9 carriers, and each artillery piece had 300 carriers, and boats that were taken onto Lake Tanganyika would use thousands and thousands. Boats would be taken apart and the steel hulls and boats carried on people's heads and shoulders through the continent. And over the course of this, there were over 1 million casualties. Again, as in so many wars, the vast majority civilians. And then the second enormous number, the carriers themselves, and then a small percentage at the top, people who actually died in battle. So that's the broad shape. And then the question was, how does one put this not as a talk or a lecture, but on stage?
Well, of course, although the last time I was here in Johannesburg was for the football, and I have distinct memory of my countrymen, mostly, and some country women, singing the song that they like to sing in such situations. And the song is 2 World Wars and 1 World Cup. That's the note of their melancholia. But they've always had a lot of problems keeping the world in World War I. And I think to put the world back, and to do it now, after all their pathology's been placed on display for the world to look at for the last 18 months, the stakes are very high to try and restore this absent memory, this failure to reckon with their history, the historical deficit, and in particular to put Africa back into the center of that reflection.
I mean, it's not so much, for me, I think it's not so much always an absent memory, it's an erasure. So there was a decision made at the high level that these carriers could not be given medals because they hadn't been combatant. So the prizes that people had hoped they would get when they returned didn't ever happen. I mean, the main prize that people hoped they would get when they came back would be civil rights. And you had a lot of the leaders of what became liberation movement, Sol Plaatje, urging black South Africans to go to the war. And Blaise Diagne, the French member of parliament, first black member of parliament of Chamber of Deputies in France, arguing that for the right for black Africans to die for France and Britain. And so the main hope, the main prize they hoped to get was citizenship, political rights, and in that they were constantly disappointed. But also there was, for example, there was the decision not to have black soldiers in the Victory Parade in 1919. So it was a deliberate hiding of things as well.
Absolutely. I think we used to talk about it as a sort of a kind of elective amnesia. And I think you're right, that lets off the hook the idea that this ignorance, which has been reproduced over generations, it was something that was done quite deliberately and for all sorts of reasons, both in terms of the life of the empire, then the Commonwealth, and, of course, from the point of view of domestic politics within Britain. This moment, at the end of the 19th century, is the moment in which the working class is remade in our country. And it's the moment where the technological changes mean that you couldn't go out of your house to buy a packet of tea or a packet of sugar without confronting the imagery of empire, the fact of becoming a global power, a preeminent force in the world, a shaper of history. And I think that's the pathology that lingers still. So perhaps the period in which it was the most radical thing you could possibly have done to seek to reacquaint that lost empire with its history, I think has slightly moved now, because the nature of the polity and the nature of its repetition of its imperial fantasies now, the idea that those things can't be given up, they're held on to very tightly. We're in a situation, Margaret Thatcher came back from the Falklands War. War's always at the center of our deficit, historically speaking, and said that we had to put the great back into Britain. She was an early adopter of some of that. And in doing that, the key to the recovery of greatness was the idea that you could transfer the spirit of being at war back into the interstices of peacetime life. Obviously, that's a mad idea.
I mean, to go back to the point just before that, and we'll come back to that, the question of memory and what are the things that we filled with. And I realized with this project, as with many other projects, the project really gets an energy when I realize my own ignorances. So with the Rome project, when I realized that the building of St. Peter's Cathedral and the establishment of the Jewish ghetto were the same project rather than two completely different things. When I thought, well, if I think of the First World, I think of what passing bells for these who die as cattle and the 5 great English war poets, and I do love those poems, but I realize those are the voices, and there are so many other voices that are gone. In the same way, where are our medals? Where are our songs? Where are our poems? So in The Head and the Load, in the performance, we do have a fragment of what passing bells for these who die as cattle, but translated into French and translated into dog barking. So it's like saying, okay, let's take this and take the sense. It's about sometimes taking the easy sense out, allowing a kind of cacophony, both to show the limits of our hearing and to allow other voices, I think, to start to emerge.
Well, that interests me because when I think of the First World War, and I'm on one side, my great-uncles were mutineers at Taranto, and on the other side, my English great-uncle, who was of German descent, funnily enough, and spoke German as a first language, was one person who I knew as a child who never recovered from the experience of everybody he knew being dead. So I suppose I'm wondering really about the point recently where, again, at the highest level, decisions were made and taken to seek to reacquaint our nation with this particular image of its past in the same or similar deeply problematic forms, but forms which are not those of the original erasure. There is a second massaging of this history into a shape that corresponds to the government's commitment to endless war now in the world, often in many of the same places where wars have been fought earlier, not least Afghanistan, but other places where the wars were fought similarly, and to try to answer the spirit of a country that looked at the possibility of turning away from that definition of itself, a fantasy of shaping world events, a fantasy of sitting at the top table, a fantasy of punching above its weight. This is the language that they use, and marched in the streets in unprecedented numbers, the biggest political demonstrations that we've ever had against the war that Tony Blair wanted to launch. And I think after that, they decided in government, of the left and of the right, that they wanted to make sure that that opposition to war was going to recede. And they set about doing that, actually. And one of the ways they've done it is through David Cameron's historic commitment in 2014 to give us this rolling celebration of the military triumph of our nation, celebrating at each point as the history of the war unfolds and commemorating each detail as it appears 100 years later.
Well, I mean, I suppose if one describes it in those terms, then I guess this is complicit. It's part of the history and one of those histories, but it's I mean, it will be shown in London in 2018, the centenary of the last year of the war. But I hope that it's a different kind of celebration and revelation. Is the hope, obviously.
Well, absolutely, and I used the word melancholia before, and the melancholic reaction to this history is to refuse to work through it. And it seems to me that where the work of attempting to work through what our relationship with the military past, the imperial past, has begun, actually it's been led by artists. It hasn't been led by academics who've been deeply complicit with the fantasies of liberal militarism. I think where we've had to look, and of course in a Brexit environment for public institutions. This is a very complex question for curators and so on. But, I mean, it's absolutely the case. I wasn't charging you with complicity. I think there has been, will always be something to think about. But in as much as we've had a rich, a useful, a positive conversation about these things, it's been artists who've led it. And, you know, think immediately of Steve's role as the war artist in Iraq and the stamps and everything, which began as a very radical gesture, and it was not immediately, it took a few years, was captured when the government began to realize that there was a ready technique at hand for shaping public opinion.
But maybe so you've been talking a lot about the shape of empire, to look at it in a way from the other side, and that is, one of the themes that has emerged as we've worked on the project, which started very much about the First World War and the carriers, the questions embedded in it, in its central paradoxes, became broader questions of the nature of colonialism. And in a way, the war encapsulates and speeds up an understanding of, in some ways, a central paradox of colonialism. And this is given in the form of Solplaatje and others saying, we demand the right to die for Britain and France, okay? People who were leaders and were fighting for an independence and for a recognition of themselves and their communities as human beings with rights and value. And on the other hand, you had people saying, why on earth should we go and die for France and Britain? And there are ways in which you can see the whole conflict in Europe, the whole of the First World War, as a completion of the work of the Congress of Berlin, of the final dividing up of Africa amongst the European countries. The biggest land changes after the First World War were the territories in Africa that changed between Germany and France and Britain, Germany losing its colonies. So it's pushing it a bit to describe it as that. But the central paradox of people who sometimes would encapsulate that within themselves, saying, should I go and fight? Maybe I'm a complete coward, but Mr. Cohen is paying me a good wage. I've got a good life here. Why should I go and fight? I must have been born a coward.
Well, I think that idea that if you're prepared to kill and if you're prepared to die for a country, you have a kind of entitlement to citizenship and political recognition is a fundamental and interesting problem, not least where those things appear within a racial order, which is increasingly a segregated one managed by violence. But I mean, the idea that preparedness to kill and die would be the key to citizenship is very interesting. And you know, of course, recently we've been celebrating the question of female suffrage and the centenary of all of that. And it's clear too that the war also plays a role in the acquisition of those political rights and the way in which that campaign was required to reconfigure itself so that it could accommodate the demands and imperatives of being at war on this new scale, this unprecedented scale.
But there was still that enormous gap, and it's a gap of trust and hope of people like Solplaatje and Dagny believing that this would be the case. And this is one of the lines. This is a Portuguese officer talking about the carriers, and he said, "They are not men because they have no name. They are not soldiers because they have no number. You do not call them, you count them. They are placed in formation by the force of a stick. You put a cargo on their heads, and that is it." And that, in a greater or less extent, was the way that, not often expressed quite so boldly as that, but that was a belief. I mean, that was how people were treated, and those hopes kind of disappeared.
I mean, I've done a lot of work in the past on Du Bois, who saw the war coming at a certain point after 1911, and all the world's cosmopolitans got together, of course, in London. I don't know why they chose London as a place to hang out, and realized that their dreams of how to remake the planet outside of the colonial order were about to be shattered by the war. And he too was somebody who looked at this recipe as of preparedness to kill and die, as a way of finding that evasive lever that could be used on the mechanism of citizenship. But I think we need to unpack that a little bit more. There's a citizenship, and then there's the manliness of it. Am I a man, as you said? Am I a man? Am I a citizen? And there's another aspect to this too. Am I a human being, to which your quotation seems to point? Du Bois used to speak of, he didn't look at the history of Negro suffering in relation to warfare through the idea of animality in the way that your officer, your Portuguese officer did. But he couldn't articulate it in English. He didn't know how to articulate it in English. So he fell back on his classical education and said that this figure was the figure of a tertium quid, a third thing lodged between the animal and the human, and that this opportunity, this preparedness to kill and die for the nation, to become a historical actor within the context of this war, this was going to be the means to bring about that form of recognition.
Paraphrase, and I think it's Frederick Douglass who said this. I think I may be wrong, and he said it obviously in relation to the United States. But as it's used in ours, it said, "Only let him carry a Union Jack, have a lion on his button, a rifle on his shoulder, bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny he has earned the right to citizenship."
Right. Well, we can see where that didn't work then.
And then there's a song. There was a song from East Africa, and a rough translation saying, "They hope we will die and not return, but that I will not do. But we'll go back home to enjoy the company of beautiful women." A kind of a resistance against that.
Well, of course, I know that you've got very interested in the figure of John Chilembwe in the Nyasaland uprising. And I suppose I had become fascinated. I remember reading George Shepperson's biography of Chilembwe years ago. And for some reason, I've wanted to go back to it, because the figure of Chilembwe has become an incredibly important vehicle for opening up these general questions in a really concrete historical way.
So in the center of our piece, of the hour-long piece, The Head and the Load, there's a section which is about the paradox that we've been talking about. And central to this is Chilembwe. Chilembwe was a Baptist minister who'd studied at a seminary in the United States, came back to Nyasaland, which is now Malawi, and started his mission and built a huge brick church on the top of Chiradzulu Hill. And at the time of the war, he wrote a famous letter to the Nyasaland Times, which was entitled "The Voice of the African Native in the Present War." And it's a remarkable letter that's in the archive, when he's essentially, to some of the key lines in it. "We understand we have been invited to shed our blood in this world's war. We ask the honourable government of our country, which is known as Nyasaland, will there be any good prospects for the natives at the end of the war? Shall we be recognized as anyone in the best interests of civilization and Christianity after the great struggle is ended? For our part, we have unreservedly stepped into the firing line of every conflict and paid a patriot's part with the spirit of true gallantry, while honor and credit have gone to others. In times of peace, everything for Europeans only, and instead of honor, we suffer humiliation with names contemptible. But in times of war, it has been found that we are invited to shed our blood in equality." And in the end, of course, he says, "We'll leave all for the consideration of the government." And this letter wasn't published. It was censored and not published, and he led an armed revolt, and the revolt was put down, and he was killed, and his church was blown up, and the British made postcards of the before and after of the blown up church, which they sold to raise war funds. And so he is such an interesting character, because in a way he compresses into 3 months. I was interested when I came across him, thinking the history of the ANC compressed from 50 years into 3 months, from mission education to gentle protest to defiant protest to armed revolt. Was all the logics, the whole unfolding logic of colonialism and its critique was there.
Except for one thing, it seems to me, and this has been of great interest to people who are focused on understanding the place and character of violence in the struggle for decolonization. And I think one thing that always struck commentators on this, perhaps hasn't struck them enough, but here's an opportunity to draw attention to it, was that given that his critique of these forms of violence within the colonial order, the violence in his rebellion was of a very particular character. It wasn't indiscriminate. It was proportionate. The women and the children were sent away so that they wouldn't become the objects of an unbridled violence like the violence which was used against him afterwards. And of course, the motto of that rebellion, strike a blow and die, has been thought by some people interested in the philosophical character of Africa's political ontology to carry within it the opportunity to really understand how that political ontology differs from the mentality of the colonizing force.
Well, I mean, one knows that from the Herero rebellion and the Herero genocide, that a small success at the start of a colonial revolt is catastrophic. The central power has to resort to unbelievable violence and terror, whether it's the complete annihilation of the Herero, which was the military policy of the Germans in 1904 to 1906 with that revolt, or the killing of Chilembwe, the killing of tens of thousands of the Mau Mau in the Mau Mau rebellion. I think there were 30 farmers that had been killed, and I think 200,000 Kenyans were killed by the British forces. So the extent of that unequal violence is astonishing. And I suppose in this piece, one of the things that's come through talking about violence and colonialism is looking at people who come a post-history of the war. Fanon writing in the 1950s and 60s. The liberation of, or the national liberation of Nyerere, Kenyatta, in that period are sort of come into the edge, almost as a coda, as voices of the dead. They've struck the blow, they've died, and there's an echo. But the one thing I should say at this stage is that the kind of clarity of thinking that, or of exposition that we're having here is very different to the process of making, which is so maybe it would be good at this point just to show some extracts of what the chaos of the workshop actually is. So all of these ideas we've been talking about are embedded in the background and this kind of my limited knowledge of the First World War and Africa in it with a talk to everyone in the workshop before we started. So it's not that we're going from nowhere, but the workshop we did to start making the piece. And so the workshop starts with not with no ideas, with some ideas, with these ideas of the First World War, of the carriers, of a procession, of a large stage. But then it was worked out, in fact, in this room, which you'll see in the video. So the first video is about 4 minutes long. Maybe we should...
I just want to say
yes.
one more thing. Yes. And that is that when I went back to the archive of writing about him, the one thing that surprised and struck me, and I went looking for him as a traveller, was the importance of photography in his life. Because I began to find numerous photographs that had been taken when he was in the United States, as well as quite a wealth of family photographs and so on that have been used here. And so I'm wondering also about him as a character within an emergent visual world.
Well, he was certainly, the photographs of Chilembwe are photographs of an Edwardian gentleman with a starched collar and a smart suit, and his wife in a black shiny dress sitting next to him, and a child. And it's very much this image of wanting to be seen. No, I choose to see myself as a person in the modern world, not as someone that comes from a pre-Christian or, he's not hanging onto different roots. He puts his, and those photographs are kind of astonishing. In the 1890s, there was a choir that came from South Africa to Britain to perform. And there's in fact an exhibition about this choir done by Philip Miller and Tutuka Sibisi at the Apartheid Museum at the moment. And this choir went to London dressed in their best Victorian smart suits, and the English presenters took one look at them and sent them to Brick Lane, where they bought whatever beads, whatever skins, whatever skirts they could to make them look like Africans. And the photographs of them, they're both portrait photographs of them in their dresses, which they were proud to be seen in, and in the costumes of this African image that they were given. And I think we can come back to Chilembwe also, because for me it's very important about what is not heard, the deafness, a deafness. It's like his letter was completely clear. It's not hard to understand. It's direct. What does it mean to be unable to hear that at all. But let's, Jean, if we watch the first, we can just stop. You can. I'm just going to move this out of the projection light. No, that's fine. Good. I mean, that should give a sense of a kind of, that's actually how it kind of looks. It's kind of crazy, and that's okay. And in that, we can look at that in 1 second, one finds moments which are there to be pulled out and to worked on. So there's obviously the language of the projection screens, which is a screen 10 meters high and 50 meters long. And then there's the language of the musicians, the chorus, the choir, and the musicians. There's a language of the people actually speaking and the movement on stage, how one articulates. So I thought maybe just show you 2 other short extracts. This one is one of the kind of some of the projection. Maybe we look a bit at this amakatsi and then maybe the birds. Okay, so there are a couple of things. It has to do with a kind of compendium of objects that were there to be blown up or destroyed, whether it's the Austrian eagle or the French cockerel or African sleeping stools. But in making it, a big question has to do with what is our shutter speed? How quickly can we turn the wheel to get the blur that's lookable at and not too fast? The sound of the doom and wee that you hear, in fact, the musicians copying a recording of a gas shell being shot off, which has this first thump as it's shot, and then this ridiculous, like a clown's whistle, as it heads towards. So there are a lot of those funny double horns that you saw and the big ears that you saw a man wearing on stage are all simply reconstructions of machines that existed to try to hear aeroplanes in advance before radar or early warning. So there's a lot of the absurdities of the machinery of war, of things to see, which get cannibalized and brought into the project.
And, I mean, I'm curious, really, given what you've said about the camera and the shutter speeds and so on, if the relationship between the development of those technologies and killing technologies that are being used on a bigger industrial scale in this conflict than ever before was something that was in your mind.
In the First World War, we're talking about now.
First World War.
Oh, okay.
First World War.
They were. So these, I mean, the shift between almost mechanical hearing devices, like the big megaphone you see at the back of the room, is a copy from a photograph of a megaphone that was used for buglers to play to sound the reveille in camps, so that it could go all the way across a camp. Gradually, during the course of the war, electronic versions or electric versions and amplified versions of these things in the cameras. They first tried to put cameras onto pigeons with clocks in them, so that the pigeons would fly and they'd reckon after 45 seconds they'd be high enough for the camera to shoot to get pictures of the enemy positions and the cameras, and the pigeons would come home, like a primitive drone. It's actually a kind of where you just relied on the homing instinct of the pigeon rather than controlling it on your cell phone. But there's always an interesting relationship between image making and technologies of war. And I think of printmaking, and I think of lino cuts and the style of lino cutting as being kind of the emblematic art form of the anti-colonial struggle here in South Africa. And one thinks of the clarity of the silkscreen of the seriograph corresponding to the certainties of the Cold War that they had. And that if one thinks now of Photoshop and the alteration of reality and image that is built into it, that's what the technology is there for, corresponding to drones dropping bombs, control thousands of war. They seem to be part of the same kind of language.
And I think there was a point where the technology of the machine gun converges with that of the emergent cine camera as well. So some people argue.
The first movie cameras were many images, 16 images taken, and they used the technology of a revolving barrel of a machine gun to do it. And of course, there's interesting about other technologies like the camera and the movie camera and the machine gun. Remington, who invented one of the repeating rifles in the time of the American Civil War, afterwards had to do something with all his factories, so he invented the typewriter. It was a development of the machinery and lathes and tool-making equipment of the rifle. So I think they do always come in.
Well, I used to work in a university which shared its campus with the Winchester Rifles, and of course all of that area of Connecticut is dominated by Remington is there, Colt is there, and there are others as well. That whole region was a real powerhouse for killing technology at a certain point.
There's one thing that I do want to show, because the second half of this evening after our talk is an astonishing dance piece, Via Canana, which is choreographed by Gregory Maqoma, who's with us. And I want to first show a fragment of, and Gregory is one of the key collaborating artists in The Head and the Load. And there's one of the questions that's come through, and it's about language, but we don't have time to go further into that, has to do with the people caught between, should I go to war or should I not? Am I a coward to not go, or in fact is it insane to to go, to feel that that struggle is mine. So there's a kind of spasm of the body, a spasm of history, of responding to a military call and not responding to a bugle and not wanting to respond, or responding against it. It's something that I think Fanon writes about somewhere in Wretched of the Earth, where there was a sentence that jumped out. But I first want to show, I'm not sure, no, that will come to. What I want to show is what I think will become one of the vital parts of the piece, which is in the section on war itself. And it's a piece that was developed by Gregory and Tulani, another dancer. And it was kind of one of the moments when you hold your breath in the workshop. You suddenly understand this is illuminating so many things. It's about violence, it's about tenderness, it's about eroticism, it's about desperately trying to not let someone be dead and bring them back. So if we can just show a couple of clips, and after that I'm going to ask Gregory if you will join us. But first to show the dance clip. The piece I want you to talk about, and maybe show us a fragment of it, had to do with, and it came out of a piece I saw of Gregory's called Sion, in which he was dancing, and it seemed to me there was a kind of a heldness in the body and a kind of contradiction in the body, and how it moved, appearing to move in one direction but moving in the other, of wanting to go forward but being held, that made me think this would be part of the language for this condition of where Africa was in the First World War. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you found that movement and where that is?
Well, I think you've already, good evening. I think you've already touched a lot on, in terms of violence and how much it kind of wears on the body. And for me, I always talk about the self-violence, which is accompanied by confusion. And in trying to eliminate that sense of confusion, I throw myself and allow the body to go to levels where it is actually no longer being able, or it's out of control, that it can actually now defend itself. So hence I'm calling it the violence of defense, because it's for me that to get the body to a point where it no longer thinks, but it can naturally defend itself.
So there was a kind of movement and holding back and almost saluting and not quite, and I'm doing it very badly, and I'm hoping you'll rescue me here to explain what I was doing.
Yes.
But there was something that once I'd seen it, or once we saw it, we understood, okay, this revealed a whole lot of sections about that kind of spasm of history, which came out of, so we've been talking about that here, but in fact it came out of the dance, and now, thanks to that dance, sits here in the discourse. But its starting point for me was in what we saw.
Yeah.
And I don't want to ask you to show it, but I do want you to, I am going to ask you to.
I knew that was coming.
You knew that was just a sense of how that.
Yeah, well.
Do you want any music with it? Have you got the foot stomps or something like that, Shana? Okay, if we can.
That will help.
Okay, good. So there were lots of different fragments of music that Philip Miller and Tutuka Sabisi had put together. And we used them, we had the musicians, and we tried the same action with different pieces of music, and they'd have very different. So that dance you saw of Gregory and Tulani being held and released, we had it both with a very thumping military kind of music and with that song of Sati and the Senegalese song as well. But this was foot stomps. In fact, it's people hitting those padded Bibles, you see, in different church communities here rather than stomping their feet. But maybe that's a good one, okay? Just jump ahead to where that is. I mean, this for me was one of the best examples that one could find of both the immediate project, but also the larger project of the center, which is kind of finding a material in which you can think. And so the logical argument and reading the text like this is one way, but there are other ways which can set off points of connection which one would not otherwise make. And now, of course, having done that, our task, Gregory's task largely, but both of our tasks is to then shape that and find how that integrates into everything else in the piece. But I'm certain that that is one of the key, both emotional but also making visible the questions of the paradox and other things we've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have to ask either Sarah or Bronwyn, do we need to bring this to a conclusion? Close, okay. It's a pity, there's so much more to say.
I'll ask you one more question, if you don't mind.
No,
okay.
Please.
Obviously the continuity with your other work is very strong, and that's obviously very important. But I feel, as someone who's seen a lot of your work over the years, that there is a greater intensity in this project than I have noticed before. Maybe that's me, but that's how it strikes me. And you used the word cacophony before. When I think about the historical epiphany of the First World War, I always think of shock. And it just seems to me that there's something here that relates really to the category of shock. that I haven't seen articulated quite so powerfully.
I mean, I hope I hadn't used that term myself. I'd thought of this, the term I'd used myself is the passionate absurd, which is, it does have to do with shock, but it does have to do with cacophony. The fact that people in Europe could not hear what people like Chilembe were saying. There was this incomprehension. And so on the one hand, you've got a European high modernism, Ravel, Satie, Hindemith. On the other hand, you've got traditions like Perde dance and drumming traditions of performing the war afterwards in dances. You've got different African choral traditions. And in the middle, you've got not just the absurdity, because more than that, the change of logic of Dada, where language is said, we cannot make sense anymore with our language. We have to demonstrate this through nonsense. And so we've got Frantz Fanon in Shangaan, and we've got the Dada Manifesto in Zulu, and the Futurist Manifesto, and a French person proclaiming the right of the French to hold their colonies because of the sound of their vowels. And so there is that level, but within it also, I hope, the trajectory of the cost of that cacophony. Thank you. Thank you
Thanks
so
very
much.
much.